leader or king or Messiah to come from the east.
Mm.
Because at the start of the great year was always a great epoch for something new happening.
Mm. Mm.
And so, they could see this happening in the heavens, so surely, something must happen at this particular era, at the new great year.
Right.
And that's why we had this star prophecy of the new king, the new Messiah coming from the east
Mm. Mm.
to rule the whole world. And that was a prophecy about Jesus, of course. So Jesus was the prince who was associated with the zodiac. He was the prince who was associated with Pisces. He was the prince who was associated with the fish.
Yeah.
And this is where we get the Arthurian legends of the Fisher King, of course.
Yeah, exactly. The Grail King or the Grail Hunter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we head off back to England again, then we have this strange Piscean temple sitting inside a Roman fortress. Now, this is very unusual because temples were not built inside fortresses. A fortress only encompassed what was really necessary for the soldiers inside.
Right, right.
The only point of luxury, I suppose, is they had the bathhouse was in there as well.
Right.
A bathhouse is essential for cleanliness and preventing disease, so
Yeah.
it is an essential component. But, things like the amphitheater and all these things were outside the fortress, including the temples. The temple was not that important.
Mm-hmm.
If you were besieged, you could take the idol of the god, the image of the god, and take it inside your fortress, and you could leave the building.
Mm.
That wasn't necessary.
Mm.
So temples weren't built inside fortresses, except in this one. And this particular fortress was made larger, 20% larger than all other fortresses, in order to hold this temple and a temple courtyard. So why do we have this strange temple, Eastern temple, a temple that must have come from Syria, Judea, or somewhere around there, inside a Roman fortress, on the edge of the empire? And this was a very prestigious temple as well, because it was all made in very well-dressed stone, whereas, all other fortresses were made in wood.
How well preserved is this today? Is there any remains left of this?
Unfortunately, probably not.
Mm.
This was recorded in the 1950s and 1960s.
Okay.
But then they built a shopping centre on top of it.
Oh, no.
So I imagine, I've been trying to get the plans of the area, but I imagine that when they built the shopping centre, they probably destroyed it.
Sheesh.
So they recorded the events, the archaeology that they could find.
Right.
And then they built an underground car park.
Hmm.
And I'm pretty sure, because I've been down there in the car park, it goes down 2 floors. I'm sure that the underground car park would have destroyed the whole thing.
They pretty much dug up that place, huh?
Yeah, they would have had to have dug it up to get the car park in there.
Mm.
So unfortunately, none of this actually remains.
You think that's...
We only have the records of the archaeologists on site, unfortunately.
Right. Do you think that could be included in the cover-up process here? What do you think?
No, I think this is... Unfortunately, this fortress is in the centre of town.
Okay.
And so this was the primary block in the centre of town.
Okay.
And obviously someone wanted to build a shopping centre, and they did.
Right.
And this was the 1960s, and car parks were just becoming the vogue, and they set the car park under.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Yeah. So they have destroyed the Temple of Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, because this temple was built by Jesus. I'm pretty sure. So what we have here is a fortress, and the reason why this fortress was in the middle of nowhere was because it was a Spandau. You know, the Spandau prison from Berlin.
Yeah.
Which housed the dangerous prisoners from the Second World War. I think this fortress did the same.
Really?
To execute Jesus because he had too many influential friends, plus the daughter-in-law of Vespasian, who was one of those very influential friends. So they couldn't execute him, so they had to send him into exile, and so to keep him and whoever was sent with him obviously safe and secure, as far away from Syria or Judea as they possibly could, they built an entire fortress just to hold these people.
And
from the number of because the lodgings, the barracks as we call them, to house the people were there on the top of the temple as well.
Mm-hmm.
We actually know roughly how many people there were as well. There were enough barracks just to the north of the temple to house no more than 100 people, so let's say about 50 people.
Mm.
And I think this entire fortress was built to house 50 dangerous prisoners, probably including their wives and children as well.
Okay. So are you saying that this old fortress is what we today would refer to as Camelot then?
Yes, essentially.
Mm.
Marrying this into Arthurian legend. Now, if you read the Arthurian legends, you will be under the impression that this happened in the Dark Ages, that King Arthur was a Dark Ages king from about the 5th, 6th century, something like that. 6th century, probably. But the Arthurian legends are very confused. If you look at the Vulgate cycle, which is about 8 volumes of Arthurian legend,
mm-hmm.
they are very confused as to what era this took place in. There are an awful lot of stories about Josephus of Arimathea. And of course he was 1st century.
Yeah.
And a lot of those stories seem to tie in directly with King Arthur for no apparent reason.
In what way?
Well, because the son of Joseph Arimathea meets up with King Arthur, and you think, hold on a minute, this is not possible. And he meets up with Lancelot and Gawain and various other people, and you think, hold on a minute, we're mixing up centuries here.
Yeah.
King Arthur is supposed to be 6th century, and here they're meeting with the son of Joseph of Arimathea, who happens to be called Josephus, of course. That was Joseph of Arimathea's son.
Right.
Was called Josephus. And the author of this particular Arthurian legend says he wasn't the Josephus who was the historian in Judea. Someone else. Yes.
That's a good one.
You have to say that.
Right.
He wasn't connected in some way with Josephus.
Exactly. This is not. Yeah, it's a common thing. Yeah. Interesting. So I mean.
So what we have here is if you strip away the Dark Ages sections that have been grafted onto this story.
Well, okay. Well, let's pause right there because that's an interesting point. We actually had a guy on the program called Florin Diaco who did some researching about this and actually are referring to the Middle Ages or even the Dark Ages as a kind of an epoch that has been either inserted into our history, so to speak, that this actually did not happen. There are a few other resources out on this. I don't know if we necessarily have to go there in order to make the stories fit, but it's certainly one tiny little small element that we can have in the back of our minds while, we have this in mind, so to speak.
Indeed. And it seems quite obvious to me that this is a deliberate insertion. And the reason it's been inserted is because the original details were quite explosive. They were heretical. Because what we have here is a story of Jesus in England. And of course, if you were telling a story about Jesus in England, you were effectively denying that he died on the cross.
Of course.
And therefore these stories would have been heretical.
Mm-hmm. And
so the easiest method of solving that problem is to say, oh, no, it's got nothing to do with Jesus, honest. It's a 6th century king,
right.
Nothing to do with the 1st century.
Right.
And that way, suddenly your story is now legal, as it were. You are allowed to actually write about it and perform it without being burnt at the stake or whatever. So I think this was a device to actually stop the troubadours being burnt at the stake. So they created a Dark Ages hero when it wasn't. The stories are about the 1st century. This is why there's a story about some of the Knights of the Round Table having a fight with a King Agrippa. And King Agrippa, I think he was defeated because they poisoned the water source, and the the land was terribly parched and there was only one spring, and they poisoned the spring, and King Agrippa had to surrender or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this was supposed to have happened in Wales. Now, you would never be short of water if you lived in Wales.
Okay, yeah.
There is no such thing as a parched Wales that only depends on one waterfall.
Yeah, of course.
There is a spring every 200 meters in Wales.
Right.
This was not a story about Wales at all. It was a story about King Agrippa.
Agrippa, right.
And he was in Syria, and this is why the land was parched and they only had one water source. It makes perfect sense if you put it back into first century Judea.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense at all if you have this story in Wales.
Hmm.
And so this, I believe, is what the story was all about. And the reason why we have this story about this heroic king. So let's just look at King Arthur for a minute. Here we have a heroic king of the English, so somehow associated with Celtic England in some fashion.
Mm.
And he has a round table which was based upon the Last Supper table. So it's quite clear that it says that the round table of Arthur was a copy of the Last Supper table.
Hmm.
And the 12 knights, of course, of the round table were based upon the 12 disciples.
Right.
So what we have is a story about a heroic king and the 12 disciples of the Last Supper table, not the 12 knights of the round table. And the reason why Jesus is being portrayed as a king, a warrior king, is because he was.
Right.
We've already been through this story where Jesus was the warrior king,
right,
who was battling against the Romans in Syrio-Judea, the king who wanted to take over Rome. So this is where the basis of the entire Arthurian legend.
And
the reason he became called Arthur was because one of the original names for Egypt, one of those names was Cam, from which we get Camelot, of course. But the other name for Egypt was Arturi.
Arturi.
We get Arthur. So he was simply known as the Egyptian king, which is exactly the same as the New Testament, and Josephus calls him as well. They call him the Egyptian false prophet. He was just known as the Egyptian Arthur.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. Arturi, and this was a name then that the natives of England were giving to Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
This was the new story that was now coming out of Celtic Britain, because they had obviously the Celts were surrounding this area, and there was this huge great prison was being erected, quite obviously housing some very dangerous prisoners, and they were obviously very interested, and they got the story of this chap, and he said his name was the Egyptian, or Arturi, and they obviously got the gist of the story of all the battles that happened in Syrio-Judea, and from that they constructed the Arthurian legend. Now, King Arthur is quite obvious if you read the Arthurian legends that King Arthur was also known as the Fisher King.
Right.
So we have these stories within the Arthurian legends about the Fisher King. But it's quite obvious when you marry the two together that the Arthur and the Fisher King were the same person. So who was the Fisher King?
Yeah, and also, a very perhaps small detail in all of this, but Arthur, of course, the connection is obviously there in the fact that he was looking for, the cup of Christ to attain,
the Grail.
Eternal life, exactly, the Grail, yeah.
And the Grail, of course, is the bloodline.
Yeah.
Now, all of you that have read Da Vinci Code and Bloodline of the Holy Grail and all that sort of business. What was it called? Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
Right, yeah.
Will be aware that one of the manifestations of the Holy Grail was the Sangreal, the royal blood.
Right.
And, a lot of these priests and various commentators, theologians recently have said, they've just invented this.